say it's asking me. Yeah.
There we go. I will just do a brief introduction. I think this is a tough time, I think, for a lot of newsrooms to actually be here live, but we seem to have quite a few people, so that's great. As you guys all know, we're launching this election project. We're doing it with the fabulous, incredible help of the Hearken team, represented here by Jenn Brandel. And she's been doing fabulous work over the last few election cycles in working with newsrooms to approach elections in a different way, which is part of what we're doing for this midterm election project. We're doing it on the most basic level, but I thought it would be very valuable for all of us to, have a bit of a primer on why do we approach elections in a new way and what does it mean and how do we do it? So Jenn is here to help us in that journey that we are launching today. So thank you, Jenn, for joining us, and take it away.
Great. I'm very happy to be with all of you. If you have questions as we go, please unmute yourself or type it in the chat. If anyone sees a question in the chat that I have not, please feel free to just let me know and interrupt me. So this is really going to be a little bit of a discussion, some interaction, and then just some more background about what you can do differently in elections this time around, because what we found is most newsrooms we talk to don't believe that the elections coverage they have done to date is what they should do going forward. So there's a degree of dissatisfaction with the status quo, but maybe a lack of options that folks are like, okay, well, what can I do instead? And how will this be different and or better? And so today my goal is to help you think a little bit differently and to show you some examples of how you can do things differently and how that can actually be better than the horse race coverage or whatever sorts of approaches you might have been used to doing before. We are in a very different context right now than we were, let's say, 2 or 3 elections ago. So the approaches that we're going to share as well are really designed to work in this context of high polarization, low trust in media, et cetera. So engagement is really core to the work here. And I'll share a few examples of how you can do this. So, all right. And this deck also will be available to everyone. So don't worry about taking notes or screenshots. We will share it out. Okay. So I want to challenge everyone here to do something that's very hard. And I know it's hard because we've done this exercise a number of times with newsrooms and they just can't always do it, which is to take off your journalism hat for a moment. I want you to pretend you do not work in a newsroom, that you have nothing to do with journalism, whatever other career you were thinking of that isn't journalism, pretend you went that direction instead. And I want you to put on just your regular person, your voter hat, your civic-minded hat, even if you're not registered or able to vote in the US, just you as a person who is not working in a newsroom. And you don't have to have any of the concerns of working in a newsroom right now. So, all right, has everyone taken off their proverbial hat? You're just a person. Give me a thumbs up if you have. I know it's hard. It's gonna wanna come back on. So I'm gonna help remind you to get out of it. Okay, so now what we're going to do, I'm putting in the chat here a link to a thing called a Jamboard. So what I'm going to do is show you here. I'll bring it on the screen. Okay, excellent. Anonymous Raccoon, welcome. If you have not used a Jamboard before, they're really easy. It's basically a way of having kind of a shared whiteboard and putting sticky notes up. If we were all in the same room, we would have a bunch of sticky notes and markers around, and we would be doing this collectively in person. So let's see, one person has joined. So please join the link in the chat to the Jamboard. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through a few different exercises real quick around news sources and just you as a person, again, not as a reporter. So I want everyone to take just a minute and create a sticky note. What you can do is you see on the left-hand side here, if you've never used a Jamboard before, it's pretty intuitive, but you got to find the sticky note, which is the 4th little icon down, and put as many sticky notes here on the board as you can around news sources you turn to before casting a ballot. Awesome. So we got Cal Matters, Texas Tribune. Okay, so just keep going. We're going to take about a minute and put in all the news sources that you do. I'll do it myself. We're just going to fill this out, and they will all kind of congregate in the upper left. So I'll start moving them around as we go. Okay, great. So yeah, keep them going. Who do you look to? And your news source could be your neighbor too. It doesn't have to be a traditional, media outlet as well. All right, we'll take like 30 more seconds. Ooh, okay, great. I'm gonna start grouping some together. Ooh, the girl in the gov. That sounds fun. All right. Okay. So this is great. What I'm going to surface here in terms of some patterns are that there's a lot of public media. Hooray, hooray. Hopefully, as just a regular person, you feel like you can turn to public media. Ooh, we got some folks in the waiting room. Let me admit them. You can turn to public media for casting a ballot. And then we got some other newspapers, some traditional sites, some digital only sites, some county elections, so some actual governance sites. We have vote.org, TikTok, bar associations, KERA, I'll put you down next to the public media folks, League of Women Voters, candidate sites, etc. Okay, this is great. So we're going to do this one a couple more times, and I'm going to throw the Jamboard in the chat again. So anyone who's just joining, here's the Jamboard. Please join at your convenience. And we're going to go up here. You're going to see a little caret, and we're going to go to the next frame. Okay, so the next frame, 2 out of 3, is what do you wish politicians in your community would be talking about as they compete for your vote? So take a moment and think about, again, you, not as a reporter, not as a journalist, but what do you wish the politicians who are serving you wherever you live would be talking about as they compete for your vote? So again, add stickies, however many you can. Great. And someone just wrote local issues. Great. Let's get more specific there. What local issues in particular? All right, we'll take just about 20 more seconds here. Great. Okay, excellent. So just take a quick look around and see what folks want to have their local politicians talk about. There's a nice spread here. We got everything from, global issues like climate change to local issues about regulation in terms of gun safety, housing costs, water, conservation, education, income inequality, reproductive rights, reparations, preserving democracy, affordable education. So there's a real big span of what folks would like their politicians to be focusing on when they're creating their platforms. All right, so last one here, we're going to go to the next frame. So click up here at the caret, you'll be on 3 out of 3. And our last question, we're just going to take a minute or two here, is just to get particular. Again, you are not a journalist in this exercise, but you also probably, even as a journalist, don't know absolutely everything about voting, running for office or government, where you live, because it's impossible to know everything. So when you think about it, like, what questions do you have just as a regular person in your community about any of these topics? Could be the mechanics of voting, it could be the mechanics of running for office, how government works, et cetera. So, put a couple questions in here of what you would love to learn the answer to. Great, keep those questions coming. Let's just take one more minute here. Okay, right on. There is so much goodness here. I want everyone to just take 30 seconds and read the questions that are on here on this Jamboard. So please take a moment and just look around, give a scan to all these questions. Okay, right on. I'm going to go out of screen share for a moment, and I'm going to ask you all some questions. I know most folks are off camera right now, so please indicate if you can via emoji or reaction. Like I'm going to put one here. You can hopefully see I got a thumbs up on my screen. So put a thumbs up or some sort of reaction if the answer is yes to the following questions I'm going to ask. And hello, Catherine. Thanks for going on camera. And no worries if folks aren't able to, but I would love to just do a quick poll here. So how many of you, by show of hands or emojis, saw a question in this last slide that you would like to know the answer to? Like you personally found something that you thought would be interesting. Okay. Seeing thumbs up from most people. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Another question for you. How many of you would be excited if the source you turn to before you vote, so think about that first slide, the sources that you go to, answered your question? So you hopefully put a question on the third page. If the Texas Tribune or KERA or NPR or wherever answered, the League of Women Voters, if they answered your question, would you be excited? If so, throw a reaction up. Okay, great. A heart, love it. Okay, so most people are saying yes here. All right, another question for you. How many of you would share the story that was created by that organization with your networks if that newsroom credited you? If they said, hey, League of Women Voters, we got this great question from Catherine Kump from X part of town, et cetera. Would you share that with your networks? Okay. All right, getting a lot of thumbs up here. Excellent. A couple more questions. How many of you would say yes if a reporter or someone who works there, like League of Women Voters might not have reporters per se, but if a person who works at that news organization invited you to participate in some part of the reporting process? Again, pretend you're not a journalist, you're just a regular person. Would you be excited to learn more about how they got that information and be part of the process? Okay. Got a few people. I'm curious to know, for those of you who aren't saying yes right now, if you're comfortable going off mute, I'd love to hear what your objections might be. I guess I'm looking at Elisa and Corin or Charlie. I see you unmuted.
Yeah. I don't know. I always think that it's so weird that people actually talk to us, because I would never talk to someone.
How come you would never talk to someone?
Participate. I would never be a good source.
How come? That bears some deeper probing.
I don't like people that much.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Corin, what about you? I saw you unmute.
I think, I mean, similar boat to Charlie. I think I'm pretty deeply introverted, even though in journalism, like still have to like amp myself up sometimes to talk to some sources. And like if I had to flip that around, like have like a ton of respect and appreciation for sources that talk to us. And then like if I flipped around, I'm like, I'm not sure I could always do that, but appreciate people who do.
That's great. Okay, I love it. So you wouldn't talk not because you're like morally object to talking to a reporter, but it's just like not your bag, or you know, if you're introverted, it's uncomfortable. I totally get that. Okay,
Right.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your honesty there. All right, I have one more question that people can react to with an emoji or reaction. How many of you would feel closer to that newsroom as a result? Like if they had taken your question, if they had answered it, if they had credited you in the story, how many of you would probably like feel a little bit differently, maybe a little closer to that newsroom if they did that? Okay, excellent. We got most people. Katie, not feeling as close to that newsroom necessarily, although maybe you went to grab a cup of water. Oh, all right, you would. Great. Sorry to call everyone out. There's always really good answers to folks who are like, no, maybe not. Okay, excellent. So hopefully you see where I'm going with all of this, which is that, go back into screen share mode. The public really wants these opportunities to be heard. They want to know that they matter. They want their questions answered. You know, you don't hear anyone out in the world saying, I need more information in general. What they need is specific information of what they're looking for. And folks are Googling for it all day long. And there's not always good answers or trustworthy answers or anything that really comes up at all sometimes when they are looking for that information. And that's where your newsroom can come in. And this is where the engagement engine can really be fueled, is with their curiosity, with their information needs. They want to participate. They are going to feel closer to your newsroom if they do. If you credit them and don't just take their question and they never know that you answered it, they're never going to know that they mattered and that they actually shaped what you did, which is really cool. You know, if you think about the way that most people get into the news and get mentioned is either because they did something really bad, they did something really amazing, like they won the spelling bee, or they were a bystander to an event. They were a vox pop on the street or something. So it's not usual for someone to just get celebrated in the news for being curious and having a good question. And everyone has a question and good questions. So the most direct and effective method to meet their needs is to just ask them what they need, which I know can be very difficult in newsrooms that are still very much kind of operationalized to be optimized for speed and efficiency and distribution. You might think, I don't have time to understand what the public needs because I got to get, 5 minutes of content out by 4 p.m. I get it. There is a tension there. But if you want to fall asleep at night every night as a reporter saying, I help the public get their information needs met and I am sure of it, you ask them what they need and they tell you, and then you go and get that information for them and hopefully with them to some degree. So this is really the public powered journalism approach. And another way of looking at it is democratizing your newsroom. If you think about the way most newsrooms work, it's a bit of an autocracy. There's a small group of people who usually don't demographically or in any way like represent the community that they serve perfectly. And that's just life. So how do you get more people represented in deciding what you cover and what stories and narratives get chosen? You let people in and you invite them to participate and you think about, how do I make sure I'm hearing from all the different demographics that we might not be representing? And so some of you have probably seen this graphic before. I'll go through this section pretty quickly and get to examples shortly, but it's really a flip of this traditional reporting approach, which is kind of a newsroom saying, here's what we think you need to know. And the newsroom is operating a bit as a parent. And the public is really abstracted into data or demographic or dollar signs or just like the audience. And this other approach of where you are really optimizing for listening first and then reporting on what you hear the need is what we call the public powered approach. And you can start with a number of different questions. What do you not know about voting that we can find out for you or with you? What do you not know about, these government positions that we can find out for you? What questions do you have for candidates that we can find out for you? So there's a lot of different ways you can frame the information you're seeking from the public to make sure you are delivering the most relevant, useful stuff for them as they do really one of the most important acts that they can do in a democracy, which is cast a ballot for who they want to see leading in their communities and making decisions on their behalf. And so in 2019, we'll send a link out to this as well, but we collaborated with Jay Rosen, the media critic from NYU, to create the Citizens Agenda, which is really the same approach applied to elections. So essentially, we believe, political and elections reporting tends to be backwards, where it's centered on the politicians and not on the electorate, where newsrooms, and I get it because it's efficient to be like, I'm just going to go to a press conference where the politician is speaking. That's really clear. I will get a story on what they said, and that will be what I create today. But that approach just really empowers the people who are running for office and not necessarily the people you're serving. And you end up being still too distant from the public in terms of getting their information needs met. So the Citizens Agenda approach, or People's Agenda, or your voice, your vote, whatever you want to call it, is this difference where the electorate becomes the first group you talk to and get their needs. And then you take them as a reporter, someone who has access oftentimes to the people in power, to get their information needs met. And then using the power of your broadcast towers and your networks and your digital sites, you get that information back to people. So you are essentially being a servant of what the public needs as they're trying to determine who to vote for. And what we found, this is a great study from the University of Wisconsin that's going to be published shortly in a book, is that the newsrooms who participated in this approach in 2020, we taught a bunch of newsrooms how to do this, said it built trust between their newsroom and community members, which, if you're looking at the latest polls, continues to plummet. Said that helping them, doing this approach, helped them listen and better respond. It increased the size of their audience, so it's also good for business, and that they will apply the same thinking to other coverage beyond elections. So I just want to go through real quick what the key steps of the Citizens Agenda are. You could really collapse them into a handful, but this is kind of like the spread out version. Is what you need to do is identify who are the people you are trying to inform. And it might not be the people you already inform, or it might be a subset of them more deeply, or it might be a broader group. It really depends on your newsroom and what your goals are. And then you ask them, what do you want the candidates to be discussing as they compete for votes? And you start getting patterns that are coming out, and you start to create this listening plan. So you create a draft agenda. It might be 5 questions, 10 questions, or topics like you did on the second page of that Jamboard, where we're looking at climate change, or reparations, or mental health support. Whatever is coming up as a priority, you start to bring that to the politicians to help them make sure that they have a platform that is serving the people that you are serving. And you just keep revising that agenda. You can publish it as a live product on your site saying, here's what we're going to be focusing on because we heard from you. And to press the candidates to answer those questions and to keep listening and iterating as you go. Now, in our experience, it's taken usually like 2 to 4 weeks of committing to this approach to get something that you can start publishing on and start asking folks about. Here's an example of a newsroom, tiny newsroom, Tiny News, of how they did this approach. And they created like these big 5 questions that they really drilled into. What are the topics you want to be talking about? We want the politicians to be answering to. And this is a tiny newsroom, so you don't need to be a giant newsroom to execute on this kind of approach. And the results are that, you create better and more original stories, because you're not just going to the same press conference and trying to beat your competition into getting it out first. You are doing stuff that is different and is differentiated. You also might be driven then to partner with other community groups who serve demographics that your newsroom might not be serving. We know public media tends to serve highly educated, mostly white audiences. So how do you partner with other groups, whether it's different languages, different socioeconomic classes, different parts of your community that tend not to listen to you? How do you have partnerships that then allow you to better listen to more people? It increases trust, as I mentioned, and it helps reporters feel accountable at the end of the day, or assured that they were serving the public better, and put out more participatory journalism processes. A couple things I wanted to mention real quick is that in this very strange, low trust environment that we are in right now, very polarized environment, this approach can be really helpful, not only for politicians, but also for people who might look at your coverage and suspect that you have an ulterior motive. So here's just a little cartoon of what we can see happen sometimes, which is the reporter will ask a candidate, if you're elected, what are you going to do about X thing? So you're taking questions that you got from the public and you're pressing that candidate. And that candidate might not respond in good faith and say, you're a liberal publication, et cetera. I'm not going to answer that. And you can go back to them and say, we're actually asking on behalf of your constituents. This is not me reporter from X station, this is someone who lives in your district and who wants to determine if they're going to vote for you. We're here to ask their questions to you. So this can be a very powerful way of subverting some of these dynamics that some politicians are using. We're also finding that in this day and age, some politicians are refusing to talk to media whatsoever. So if you are in that position and you're trying to talk to candidates and they've just completely given you the cold shoulder, we encourage you in your stories to be writing how you've reached out to them, how many times, how much time you gave them to respond, and start to keep a tally of the people who are getting back to you, AKA getting back to the people you're serving, and the people who aren't, and make that part of your storytelling. Another opportunity is you can have new dynamics with the public here. So if someone is saying, hey, I can't believe you're writing this story, or you're focusing so much on this topic, why are you doing that? You as a newsroom can come back to them and say, oh, it sounds like you have other things that you want us to focus on. Tell us, we are listening. This is how you can participate, and here's how you can be involved. And so you can also kind of disarm people who might be coming at you in the comment sections or otherwise and accusing you of something. You can say, we're here to do your work. What is it that you want to know from politicians? Okay, so before I keep going, I just want to pause for a moment because I'm like having a wall of talking right now and see any questions that folks have so far. Feel free to come off camera or ask in the chat or come off mute. I mean, just take a moment here. Also take a sip of water.
Well, and I was just going to say that I really wanted Jen to talk about this because I think it's such an important approach to election coverage. But we're not asking you all to launch the citizens agenda. I wanted to introduce it to you. Maybe some of you are already doing it. Maybe you've heard about it. I just think it's important for all of us to understand kind of what a lot of stations are doing and how they are thinking. And it's meant to inspire you.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. I should have said that at the beginning. Thank you, Elisa. This is just one way to do it, but some of these dynamics are things that you can put into your reporting regardless of the types of coverage that you're doing. You can think about how do you start to shift these dynamics? How do you show that what you're focusing on is built on what you're hearing from people or what their needs are? And it doesn't have to be a full-on citizens agenda. But I will show you a few examples of newsrooms that have done this in public media as well. But before I do that, I wanted to hit on a point that hopefully you've heard in other talks before from some of the folks who are training you all on engagement, just to think about this nuance here, which is audience engagement does not necessarily equal community engagement. And Ariel Zarolnik, who's at KPCC or SCPR in Los Angeles, had a great prediction in the Neiman Lab journalism. I have the piece linked in the slide. But essentially, the difference between audience engagement is really thinking about who are you already serving and how do you keep them happy, coming back to you, feeling satisfied, understanding what you do, and just making sure that you have a robust business of the people who are already coming to you. And with that, you want to focus on your current audience members to better understand their needs, to design for them. You're looking at data, people coming in, how often are they coming, et cetera. That's really important. Every newsroom should be doing that, understanding who is coming to them and what they're finding valuable. Community engagement is a slightly different approach. This is at looking at who are you not necessarily serving? What is the needs of the community writ large? And since public radio, you all are serving geographic locations, thinking about who are you not hearing from? What socioeconomic class, age group, background, race, et cetera, gender, whatever sorts of ways you want to think about how you want to better serve the people in your listening range, thinking about what are the voids and how might you fill those. And the approach to doing good community engagement will often include physically and digitally appearing where the people you want to be listening to and serving are. And then you're centering also in this approach the community that a story is about, rather than reporting on a community for a different audience and saying, hey, here's what's happening over here. But you're really kind of shifting the frame a little bit to help be an advocate and a problem solver or a reporter for that community. And it often generates partnerships with other organizations and groups. If you're like, hey, we really want to reach, let's say, Spanish speakers, and we don't have those relationships, how might we partner with this local organization, with this nonpartisan group, with this other maybe other news organization that serves that audience in Spanish? There's lots of different ways to think about that. So as you're doing elections coverage, really be explicit in your newsroom to whatever degree you can of what part of it is meant to serve your current audience and what degree of effort and how are you going to go about serving people who aren't in your current audience. And there's a great exercise that you can do here that I will link to. We don't have time to do it today collectively, but it's pretty simple and it can take you about 5 minutes to do. And it's something that some newsrooms are using all the time, basically in every editorial meeting when they're doing a big story. They think about who are the stakeholders, who is going to be affected by the story, and how might we make sure we're reaching all the people, whether it's in the actual sourcing of the story of those people affected, and the distribution. How do we make sure we're tagging groups of people who might not know that we did this story, but who will be affected by the decisions within it or the power within it? So what you can do here, it's also called network mapping, stakeholder mapping, user mapping, empathy mapping. There's lots of different ways of naming the same thing. But what you do is at the center of a map, and you can do this with a pen and paper, you can do it with a Jamboard, whatever you're comfortable with. Put the topic in the center, the thing you're going to be reporting on. It might be a particular story about a candidate. It might be about the general election, might be voting rights, like whatever it is, that's the main topic. And then write down all the people and groups that are affected by that issue and by the content that you're going to be putting in that story. And, what typically happens is people have the first few minutes is very easy of just like, oh, these are the obvious characters or the obvious people who are going to be affected. And after a few minutes, you start to think even more broadly about who else by design is going to be affected down the road, and how might you include them in the story? How might you get the story out to them? Or how might you do another story that's from that angle of something that you might not necessarily expect? So stakeholder mapping can be super, super useful as you think about engaging your audiences and who is affected by the issues, like we looked at the second slide, whether it's climate change, reparations, mental health access, et cetera. Who's affected by those and how do you make sure they are centered in the stories? There are lots of ways to listen to your audiences / communities. You can collect questions, votes, or submissions on any topic. And I wanted to highlight that because that is what we're doing with America Amplified in this midterm project, is getting questions. And we really love questions because it's efficient. It produces actionable insights. I see I have 2 commas there, please forgive me. It produces actionable insights in the fact that a question is a story assignment. Getting the answer can be your story. And so you're not just getting overall topics, do more coverage on education. And then you're stuck in an editorial meeting saying, okay, what does that mean? We just did 20 stories about education, but what are we missing? So a question can really be specific and useful for you to understand how to turn that into content. And it can be really broadly accessible. So everybody has questions, and you can always ask for follow-up questions on something too. Other ways to listen that I think are also very valuable, but maybe not as actionable all the time or as translatable into content, are comments, reactions on coverage on whatever platforms you're using. Call-in or AMA features and Q&A at events can be really useful as well. And you can use the questions you're getting in for engaged elections to also power Q&As or call-in shows, et cetera. You can also conduct empathy interviews with people that you are trying to better reach and understand, how you can do things differently or what topics are they really interested in. That can be less efficient, but it can be very deep and profound in terms of the insights you get. Same with focus groups, advisory councils, partnering with other groups or communities outside your audience to get and solicit the information that can help you understand where to put your energy. I want to pause for a moment and say, are there any other ideas or things you want to add to ways to listen to your audience or community here? Okay. Oh yeah, Charlie.
Oh, just real quick, just from experience, I know when I was at the Dallas Morning News, we launched a Hearken project like this, and what she's saying about how the kind of the journey to answer the question can be as much as of a story as anything. A lot of times we had stories that the answer is really basic, but trying to find the answer becomes a much more interesting story. We had one person ask, a kid asked, where does the poop go when you flush? And we had a whole reporting project on talking about the city's water treatment plant and the infrastructure. And it was, very cheeky and fun, but it became like a narrative thing, trying to figure out
Totally.
where does the poop go. So even a simple question can be, and it was very well read, very well received, very well shared, continues to do well on the website. So they're searchable things. They're SEO friendly. They're great.
Oh, Charlie, I couldn't have asked you to share a better example there. This is exactly it. The other thing, so what Charlie's saying about questions is so great because in this highly polarized environment that we're in right now, questions are a way of kind of diffusing the opinion, I think this, you think that, here's two people arguing, oh, who's right? The question is a way of doing a story that is not necessarily conflict based. It can be about the quest of how you found an answer, how difficult it was to find that answer. Because sometimes, what you're up against as a reporter isn't someone who's, trying to be a jerk. It might be that you have inefficient systems and that this data isn't available or that no one's ever asked that question before. So we can only pontificate. There's lots of different ways that individuals in conflict don't need to be the center of your story. And it can be more about how do we go on an exploration of learning and find something out together, which can also allow people who aren't likely to be showing up in your comment section feel like there's a place to participate. You've maybe seen studies before that the people who tend to show up in comment section tend to be male. They're often white, and they often are coming spoiling for a fight. And so if you're asking for people's questions, you're attracting people who are at a point where they're humble enough to say, I don't know something and I want to learn and I want to understand and participate. And that's a healthy approach for this time we're living in. So if you're doing an engagement project of any given sort, and you're asking for people's reactions or their comments, just know that it might start to close people's minds rather than open them. If you're asking them for their questions, what are they unsure about? Where do they feel torn? What do they not understand? You start to build more opportunities for nuance and complexity and help kind of this extreme ends of things start to break up a little bit and have people be fuller versions of themselves. So Charlie, your example is perfect. And we also found in Chicago, when I was at WBEZ, where I used to be a reporter, we got that question from a 5-year-old who's probably 20 now, about where her poop goes, and did a whole live event on it. And we printed out the answer to the question on toilet paper rolls and we passed him out at the event. It was a kids-based event on poop because they're obsessed with it. And there's so many creative ways you can report stories based on questions and these quests. It's a really fun way of doing things. Okay, so I'm going to run through just a variety of examples. Oh yeah, Elisa.
I just have to say that I unfortunately have to pull out of this
Yeah, no problem.
training. So before you end, I just wanted to say thank you. And there will be obviously other America Amplified people on, but I will have to go. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. All right, thank you so much. Excellent. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and I'm just going to buzz through some examples and then give you all a chance to ask further questions or talk about what your newsroom is doing. And if you're running into any, blockers, I can help troubleshoot. But here are just a few examples. So we got the citizens agenda approach, which you can, I have 2 examples here from public media. One is Casey McDermott. I'm trying to remember. This might be NHPR. And then the other one from KPCC/LAist, where they're asking, what do you want politicians to be talking about as they compete for your vote? And it can apply to specific interviews you're doing. So we're interviewing the District 3 Board of Supervisors. What questions do you have for them? You can really apply this at whatever kind of degree of specificity you want. You can also collect questions, and this is really what America Amplified is going to be partnering with you to do, is about voting, and the civic process. So WNYC did a great series in 2018 with us, Your Voice, Your Choice, and it was asking questions about just civic engagement, what questions you have about voting in New York City. We also work with the Better Government Association, and people were asking questions about the mechanics of voting. And the answers to these questions can become integrated into voter guides, standalone features, support building out kind of FAQs that you have when it gets closer to the actual day of the elections. And then also folks have done really amazing work doing engagement across divides. So KCRW and West Virginia Public Broadcasting partnered, I think it was just 2020, can't remember, but they did Red State, Blue State. And so they ask people, what do you want to tell someone who has a different political belief than you? And you could think about lots of different ways of creating this kind of conversation. And so they created content from people in California, people from West Virginia, that was all about kind of how to listen to each other and how to better connect. And I put down here, like, you could also ask, what questions do you have for someone with different political views? Because you might want to tell someone something not so nice, but maybe you have an honest question for them. That isn't like, how do you sleep at night? But something different. And then you can also partner and serve multiple languages. So here's an example from Louisville Public Media. They collected questions on candidates in Spanish, and the Hearken Tech is able to operate in whatever languages folks need them to. At WBEZ in 2020, they did some really great town halls that were virtual given COVID and everything. And they had 5 different languages that were simultaneously translated so that people in these areas of town, and these were areas of town that they hadn't traditionally really been a force in, like you could go to this area, little village, and ask someone what's WBEZ and they would not know. So they really made sure that they targeted different areas of town that they hadn't served well and listened to those politicians and invited people to participate there. And then, beyond listening, it requires actually participation. So there's so many ways the public can participate in your story gathering process and your distribution and everything. And there's many ways you can acknowledge them. So I just wanted to throw a quote in here from Ariana Tobin, who's an amazing engagement thinker at ProPublica. And she wrote, if you want someone to thoughtfully participate, contribute, or weigh in on a subject, you must tell them what they will get from the exchange. And then to get them to engage again, you just have to deliver on that promise. So, I always tell newsrooms who are like, we want to do engagement, that they really need to commit to it. Because if you start to say, hey, we're going to listen to you, and then they don't understand or see that you followed up, it's going to become the boy who cried wolf over time. And they're going to be like, you're not actually listening. I don't matter. And it's worse to do that than to not listen at all. So you really have to just make sure you're going to follow through on things. And so we have this graphic at Hearken we call the engagement ring, is how to make sure that you are closing that feedback loop. So you might invite feedback from the public in the form of questions, comments, insights, whatever. They're going to provide it. And if you don't actually follow up, we joke and call it that you're being an ask hole. So you're not actually giving them the expectation, of responding to them. And maybe you're not able to respond to every question, but you're at least able to say, hey, thank you so much. We're not able to respond to every question, but we will be back in touch with you if we are able to answer your question or if we follow up on this. So at least the expectations are set accordingly. And then you can listen to their input. You can then create content that's based on that input and acknowledge that you got it from, let's say, Catherine asked the question, and you put Catherine's name in the story. You let Catherine know that she mattered and made a difference. She's going to share it with her friends. She's going to share it with her community, and it's going to show your community that that you do listen, and that here's someone just like you who's curious. Now you can ask a question. So the depth of participation and representation of the people participating equals the likelihood to share content. So you want to make sure whenever you're doing engagement work, and you can have someone named, even if they want to be anonymous, you can say, we got this from someone who prefers to be anonymous. That's fine. But at least you're still acknowledging that it came from outside of your newsroom, that you are listening. So you can invite their input. I highlighted that because you'll be doing that with America Amplified. You can include them in your reporting process, whether that's just acknowledging by name, including their photo in a story and a little brief profile, featuring them in a story, and allowing some ride along. That's kind of like from small to large degree of participation. And when you're thinking about digital, not print here, unless you guys happen to have like some sort of print product, but you want to acknowledge people as soon as possible as you can in a story. That might be in the intro or in the kicker, or the bottom of a story, in a sidebar. You want to make sure that the stories you do that have engagement at the core acknowledge that you did that and acknowledge the people who participated. So here's some examples from WBEZ Chicago. This great question asker, JJ, wanted to know about LED lights in the city and how it affects wildlife. And so there's a nice little write-up more about him, which again humanizes the stories, makes the newsroom really show, or it helps the newsroom show the public that they're listening to all different people and not just folks who are voting age or older or whatever. From the ABC in Australia, here's an example of a little sidebar they have in a story of this guy, John, who asked a question and why he was curious. And then to invite more participation, you need to think about either in your radio stories or in the digital stories of how you can say, hey, this story came out of this project where we're listening to people. Here's how you can participate. So it might be in the intro you put it, or midway in the story, or in a sidebar. You just want to make sure you let people know how they can participate too. And you can also just do promos or segments between shows or PSAs to let people know that they can participate in broadcast. So that might be at the top of the story, the end of the story, give a short URL to say, here's where to go, KPCC/ask, to ask your questions, etc. And what's been really cool is seeing some of our partners really make the folks who ask the question the star of the show. So in this example in Australia, they have this guy, Matthew, who's asking about tunnels under the parliament. He's the main protagonist in the story. You don't see a reporter. They just produce the story and he's taking you through everything. So the public is getting to see the answer and this quest for information through the eyes of someone like them, which also helps them think like, oh my gosh, I want to do something cool like that I couldn't do unless the newsroom gave me access to the halls of parliament. So it's a really great way of really showing that you're listening and featuring the people in your community and representing, more people than might be represented in your newsroom. And really, at the end of the day, this is good business too. So if you're struggling within your newsroom to convince anyone that needs convincing that this is a good use of your time, let me know. I'm happy to send along whatever data they care about, because we find that this approach really yields better everything, more popular stories, more people giving you their email address, more people coming back, more people becoming members, etc. So this is how I'm wrapping up here. This is how people are going to work on this project with America Amplified and Hearken, and just to give you a sense for what the flow is going to be here. So America Amplified has decided with you all to collect questions about voting. And the prompt here is, what do you need to know to participate in the upcoming primary election, or something of that sort. So you're really going to be collecting questions about voting, the mechanics of it, etc. And we're going to use the Hearken engagement management system, which is the tech that we built to do this. And for people who want to text in their question, we have an integration with this, with Ground Source, which is an SMS tool. So all of those questions are going to flow into a back end that the America Amplified folks are going to be in control of. And you can also advertise this opportunity for people to ask questions in a lot of different ways. You can embed it in a sidebar in your story. You can put it at the bottom of a story. You can put it on your homepage in a tile that you might typically use for advertising or whatnot. You can also direct link to it for social media or newsletters. You put it on reporter bio pages. Maybe you have a few folks focusing on elections and you just want to give one more doorway for people to find this opportunity to ask questions. And so what's going to happen here, this is the flow on the right, is questions are going to come in, the America Amplified team, and Charlie is going to be, one of your main people looking at these and deciding, is America Amplified going to report the answer, or work with your newsroom, to report the answer. And then what you want to make sure you do is thank and acknowledge the question asker in the story that you're doing. People can opt to say, don't publish my name. So if they do, you just want to let them be anonymous. But again, you want to tell them that you listened and that this story came from someone like them. And then what's really cool, and we're very excited to partner with you all on this, is using a new feature in our back end that we call auto categorization. And we partnered with KPCC in Los Angeles to create this feature based on the thousands of questions they got on COVID and needing to really understand quickly, okay, where should we put our limited resources and time and energy? And so we're able to bucket essentially the questions into different topics that then you can see, okay, there's so many questions about mail-in voting, so let's put a lot of energy there. And there's only a few questions about this, so maybe we can just do a few stories on that front. So this is a cool thing that Charlie will be working on, and the America Amplified folks, to look for patterns within what's coming into your newsroom and within the whole America Amplified network, which is really exciting because we can start to see from around the country what are some of the common trends and questions coming in that everyone wants to know. And that gives America Amplified the opportunity to make some good, either evergreen or just, content that can service all of your newsrooms and be really, really helpful. And I wanted to just share 3 quick opportunities before I close out here, which is today, actually in like an hour, we're going to be or half an hour, we're going to be talking about Democracy Day, which is the International Day of Democracy is September 15th. And we invite all newsrooms who want to participate and publish something on the 15th about democracy specifically. And we have the whole content menu, et cetera. And you don't have to go to the webinar to participate, but I can, in the follow-up, send you more information and how to sign up to be a partner. It's really simple. Also, if your newsroom is doing any coverage, investigative work around threats to democracy, you can get up to $10,000 from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. They have a rolling application right now, and I'll send you that link too. And then for any partners of America Amplified who aren't partners of Hearken already using our tech, and if you're interested in using this approach for any kind of work that you do, elections or not, we'd love to have you. So we did get some funding from philanthropists that are allowing us to give a slight discount, which is very exciting. And we have a demo next week on the tech if you're curious to learn more. And lastly, we have Election SOS, which is a giant initiative we did in 2020 and are doing again this year to help news organizations get the answers they need around elections. So we have an amazing expert network of about 300 different experts around the country who have been vetted by us in the American Press Institute that you can turn to. They also tend to be not as many white men as we might hear in those expert positions. So it's nice and helps with diversity. We have webinars, checklists, scenario planning guides, et cetera. So we encourage you to go to Election SOS as well. Okay, I know that was a wall of information. I'm going to stop screen sharing and we have a few minutes left. What questions or comments or ideas or anything do you have? We have time to connect on this front. And Charlie too, if anything comes to mind that you want to share from your experience, feel free.
Part of the citizens agenda piece had me thinking about our candidate profiles, which have kind of traditionally been a staple of our coverage, and wondering how organizations that have really taken the citizens agenda approach have either tweaked candidate profile pieces or maybe abandoned them altogether for the introduction of the candidate to voters.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a number of different ways newsrooms have approached this. Sometimes they do the citizens agenda, early on in the process, so that whenever they do a candidate profile and they get an interview, they ask that candidate the questions that are, about the topics that really float up to the surface. So for every candidate profile, you could kind of create a structured section that says, here are the 3 top issues for voters in Montana. This is what this candidate had to say about X, Y, and Z. And that could become something that lives on their candidate profile page, but is also something you could create a whole feature about of see what all the candidates think about this topic. And you could, have drop downs or whatnot and organize that data in a really structured way if you can. So there's that approach of doing the citizens agenda early, but then there's also an approach of where you put out the candidate profile and say, what questions do you have for this candidate if we get the opportunity to interview them again? Or what follow-up questions do you have about, their background or what we have in the profile? Because you might actually know the answer and it might not have just ended up in reporting because you couldn't do a 5,000 word piece. So collecting follow-up questions on the candidate profiles can be really useful as well. So those are kind of two ways of doing it. Oh, a third way is if you have candidates and you're able to get them all at some moment, whether that's town hall or a call-in show, and they're all going to be on there talking about something, you could collect questions ahead of time saying, we're talking to all the mayoral candidates next week, over the course of the week. What questions do you have for them as they compete for votes? And you pick out a few questions and ask all the candidates that same question. So does that help, Corin? Is that useful?
It does. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. Yeah.
And something you just said, Jennifer, reminded me, keep in mind that some of these questions we're going to be able to answer really quickly, really easily, like what kind of ID do I need to bring to the polls? We can answer that really quickly. We're building a database to just fire that answer off to that person, easy peasy. But there's a kind of a scale of questions that kind of go from that to where we obviously know the answer and you can tell you really fast, all the way up to, hey, this might be an enterprise story or an investigative story that we need to throw some weight behind. So part of what I'm going to be doing is reaching out to you guys as we get those questions on that scale to say, hey, this might take some more local reporting. Hey, this may take a couple calls. Are you interested? and see how we can partner on that kind of stuff. But yeah, I again, from my experience, I've done stories that are super quick. I got one. I did a bunch of Texas culture stuff when I was at Morning News. So we had one that was there is a myth in Texas that it's the only state that can fly its flag at the same height as the U.S. flag, because Texas, of course, they think that. And it was a really quick story to just say, no, that's not a thing. Throw it up, right? Another question, there's the state lizard is the horny toad. And someone said, where have all the horny toads gone? I haven't seen one in a really long time. And that became a year-long narrative talking to environmental folks in the state that are trying to bring this lizard back, this endangered lizard back. So you can really take it from, a quick, let me Google that for you, to a very in-depth story. And that's one of the really cool things about this, is that you can find all kinds of reporting opportunities within these questions.
I love that, Charlie. I remember the horny toad series, and
Good stuff.
my recollection, it was very, very highly trafficked as well. It did very well.
It did pretty well.
Yeah.
And the experiment they were doing in the story worked, which is the best part. So
that's so cool. I love it. It's a great example. Well, we have time for maybe just one more question, but also if you folks need to run, because I know it's half past the hour, feel free. Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, expect to see the deck later today. I'll send it to the America Amplified folks to send along to you all. And I'm available to answer questions as you have them as well. Charlie's going to be your go-to. Oh, Samantha Guzman is entering right now. Be like, Samantha, sorry. This is going to be a very short webinar for her. I'll stop recording. Okay.